When we think about fall protection, we usually picture a harness, maybe some rules on a clipboard. But what if the biggest danger isn't actually the height? What if it's how our brains get so used to it that we stop seeing the risk? We're going to build a professional's framework for staying safe, and it goes way beyond just following the rules. And that idea, this predictable surprise, man, it just gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's that unprotected edge you walk past 20 times a day. The hazard is always there, but our perception of it fades. We get blind to it. And at that point, an accident isn't a surprise at all. It's predictable. So how do we fight that? We need a plan. First, we'll dig into why we overlook obvious dangers. Then we'll build our framework with something called the hierarchy of safety. After that, we'll get into the specifics, preventing falls, controlling them when they happen, the all-important human factor, and finally, what to do in the critical moments after a fall. And that right there, that mental blind spot, is exactly why just be careful is probably the worst safety plan you could ever have. Seriously, our brains are literally wired to ignore the familiar. That's why we need a system, a structured way of thinking that forces us to see the danger fresh, every single time. Well, that system, it's called the hierarchy of safety. And this is not just some checklist, okay? This is the playbook the pros use to systematically take risk apart. It's a top-down strategy that makes us start with the very best solutions, not just the easiest ones. And here's the thing. This hierarchy is non-negotiable. You always start at the top. The best thing you can do, hands down, is just eliminate the hazard completely. Can you do the work on the ground instead? If you can't, okay, then you move to prevention, putting up a physical barrier. Only after that do you even think about controlling a fall with personal gear. And a warning sign that's always, always the last resort. Okay, so sticking with our hierarchy, the first place we go is prevention. The goal here is simple, but it is so powerful. Just deny access to the hazard. We're talking about real physical systems that stop a person from ever getting near a dangerous edge to begin with.
You've seen guardrails a million times, right? But have you ever really thought about what goes into them? This isn't just a fence, it's an engineered system. That top rail is set at 42 inches because that's the center of gravity for most people, and it's built to take 200 pounds of force pushing on it. Every single part has a job to do, turning a simple railing into a life-saving barrier.
Okay, this next part is super important to get right. The difference between fall restraint and fall arrest. They sound similar, but they do completely different jobs. Restraint is like a leash on a dog. It's short enough that you physically cannot reach the edge. Simple. Arrest is the safety net. It only does its job after you've already gone over the edge. And just look at the difference in anchor strength. That tells you everything about the insane forces involved in stopping a falling person. But, sometimes you just can't put up a guardrail, and you have to work near the edge. That's when we have to move down the hierarchy to control a fall. This is where we're using a fall arrest system. We're basically saying, okay, a fall is possible here, so this gear is our last line of defense. So let's play out a scenario, a really important one. Imagine you're tied off to an anchor right above you. You're wearing a standard 6-foot lanyard. You slip and fall. How much empty space do you actually need below you to be safe? 6 feet? Maybe 10? The real number is going to shock you. Yeah, the answer is almost always way more than you'd guess. First, you've got the 6 feet of the lanyard itself. Then the shock absorber has to deploy. That adds another 3.5 feet. Then you've got to account for your own body, from the D-ring on your back to your feet, plus some harness stretch. Let's call that 6 feet. And then you have to add a mandatory 2-foot safety factor on top of all of it. You add all that up, and you get 17.5 feet. Let that sink in. That is almost 2 stories high. If you don't have 17.5 feet of clear space below your anchor, that 6-foot lanyard is completely useless. It's just a false sense of security. Knowing this math is literally a life or death calculation. And that massive fall distance, that's exactly why these things exist. Self-retracting lifelines, or SRLs. The absolute best way to think about them is like a seatbelt in your car. Line pays out as you move around, no problem. But the very second it feels that sudden jerk of a fall, it locks up instantly. This can take a fall from 6 feet down to just a couple of feet, which means you need way, way less clearance. And remember, whether you're using a lanyard or an SRL in a fall arrest system, the anchor point it's tied to has to be rated for 5,000 pounds per person. That's about the weight of a Ford F-150 pickup truck. It's a pretty sobering number when you think about the forces we're dealing with. You know, we can talk about gear and anchor points and fall clearance calculations all day long, but the absolute best equipment in the world is totally useless if the person using it isn't trained correctly. And that brings us to the most critical and honestly the most unpredictable part of this whole system, the human factor. Let me tell you a quick story, and this is a true one. A safety expert was testifying in a lawsuit where a worker had fallen and was blaming his harness. In the middle of the courtroom, the lawyer asks the guy to show the jury how he wore it. The worker stands up and proceeds to put the entire harness on completely upside down. It wasn't the gear that failed, it was the training. And that story is exactly why doing a pre-use inspection is not just some box you check. It is a vital habit. We're not talking about a quick glance. You should be using your hands, feeling that D-ring for any nicks or burrs. You run the webbing through your fingers, feeling for tiny cuts or stiff spots from chemical burns. You check every stitch. You're hunting for that one tiny flaw that could cause a catastrophic failure. And really, all of this, it feeds into something bigger, a company's safety culture. In a great safety culture, people understand that the official rules, the regulations, they aren't the goal. They're the absolute bare minimum. They're the floor. Real safety is about leadership pushing everyone to be better than the bare minimum. So, what happens if the worst happens? The system works, the fall arrestor is arrested, but now you have a worker just hanging there in their harness. The fall itself is over, but a brand new emergency, a very time-sensitive one, has just begun. You've got about 15 minutes. That's the average time before something called suspension trauma can start to become a serious, life-threatening problem. The very harness straps that just save their life can start cutting off blood flow. Blood pools in their legs, and the brain doesn't get enough oxygen. A clock is ticking, and it is ticking fast. And look, there's one rule here that is just absolute, non-negotiable. Any piece of equipment that is involved in stopping a fall has done its job. It's a one-time use deal. That harness, that lanyard, every single component has been exposed to massive forces it was never designed to take twice. It all has to be taken out of service and destroyed, period. And that brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of all. Your gear is perfect, your training is up to date, you do your inspections every single day, but what is the actual on-site practiced plan to get that person down safely inside of that 15-minute window? Because preventing a fall is only half the job. Knowing how to perform the rescue, that's the other half.